What's going on, guys? It is your boy Bodhi right here. So, in this one, I'm gonna be talking about some of the buffs that they have applied to old content, and I'm gonna explain why I disagree with it. So, some of the content that they have buffed is current favor. They have scrapped current favor completely. They have made a lot of skilling updates, a lot of buffs to some of the skills. They have made updates to Mage Training Arena. They've made it easier. They have made changes, or they have intentions of making changes to the Dragon Warhammer by making it more common, and they have made some of the Slayer monsters more desirable to kill, some of the ones that were regarded as bad ones. So I'm gonna attack uh, this sort of approach to the game because I fundamentally think that it comes from a misunderstanding of what the game should be like. When you go out and make changes like these to old content, you don't really have a firm framework to work from when you propose something like this. So I could attack all of these updates from like the substance, like the matter. What is it about each of these updates that is wrong? But it's not so important whether it's right or wrong in isolation to have one particular update being one way or another. So rather, I will reject these from a firm principle, a firm good framework. So, for instance, if you were to attack this from like a meta perspective, you could take current favor and you could say you could look at something like current favor and you can say in the beginning of current favor you had you had it so if you gain favor in one house you would decrease favor in a different house. That was how it initially was, and then they changed it to be so that if you had if you got favor to 100%, then you were allowed to gain favor in a different house because then your favor would be locked in, and then they just increased the rate with which you get favor, and then they added quests that also gave you favor. Like they just applied buffs to the acquiring of favor across the entirety of the board completely. So that just highlights what a shit show something like current favor is. So you can easily reject like something like removing favor very easily because they have already made so many changes to it that it's basically non-existent at this point. But it's not so important whether one thing is right or another when it comes to current favor. It's more important the underlying principle, which is what I will get into in a bit. A different attack angle on some of these buffs that they have made would be something like Slayer monsters. They have made buffs to old Slayer monsters or Slayer monsters that are deemed not very good to kill. But in doing so, you are basically making it so now all Slayer monsters are good to kill, and there are no bad Slayer monsters to kill. And this is not a very good approach because if there's no bad Slayer monsters to kill and all Slayer monsters are good, then it doesn't really matter what task you get. Then it's basically the same, and then it follows that you could basically make it so you can just choose what task you want. Like, tasks can only really be good if they are good relative to bad tasks. So if bad tasks don't exist, then it doesn't really make sense to speak of good tasks. So that would be a way of attacking something like the Slayer monster buff that they have made. But this is not really important because we can already reject something like Slayer buffs and the buffs to all of the other things just from a firm principle, just from a firm framework. So that's what I'm gonna do instead, rather than talking about all of these updates in isolation because it's not really important. So yeah, let's get into it. So this is what account progression should look like. Account progression should be a factor of time multiplied by effort. Account progression should not be time multiplied by effort plus the factor of temporal spatiality, which is just a convoluted way of saying where your account exists in time and space. So, for instance, if you make your account here or you make your account here, or you make your account here. All these three people, assuming that they put in the same amount of time and they put in the same amount of effort, should experience the same amount of gains. To think that this guy here, he deserves to have a better account than this guy here because he made it in 21 is completely irrational. There is no person who can defend this position. All these accounts should experience the exact same progression as one another. And no one can come up with a good argument against what I'm saying right now. Like, you are so irrational if you actually disagree with this take. So, where your account exists in time and space is not important. All these accounts, assuming they put in the same amount of effort, should have the exact same account. So, the factor of temporal spatiality, by this I just mean time basically, but this time here, this time I'm talking about here is very important, but this time is not important, like where your account exists in a continuum of time. So whether you play in 2018 or you play in 2014, completely unimportant here. So I'm also consistent with this, so it goes both ways. For instance, if you were to have, say, let's say you have high XP rates here, if you then, or let's just say here in 2014, doesn't really matter, if you have high XP rates here in 2014, or you just have the base rate XP rates, the question would then be, should you then lower the XP rates? Let's say Jays have realized that, oh, now we have, let's say, 400 maxed accounts in the game. Would it then be reasonable to, because 400, you can see 400 maxed accounts is a lot of accounts that are maxed, would it then be reasonable to lower the XP rates so that fewer people max, or so that the rate with which people max decreases a little bit, because we've seen that people now 400 people have maxed and we want to make sure it doesn't spin out of control. So you could raise the argument that because of this, you want to lower the XP rates from what they were in 2014. Now we want to have lower XP rates in 2017. But I obviously disagree with this completely because of the aforementioned principle. These accounts should all experience the same amount of progress for the same amount of effort and the same amount of time that they put in. So it would also be wrong to lower the XP rates. So people think I'm just I'm just against Easyscape, but this is completely untrue because I'm also against Hardscape. I don't want the game to be made harder, so I'm very consistent in this regard. So let's say this is the factor of 1.0. The temporal spatiality factor, and here they want to decrease the XP rate, so now you get 0.8. I think this is a grave wrong. I don't think they should be doing this. And same here with 3.0. This is also wrong. Both of these are wrong. It should be 1.0 for all of them. So this is the only consistent position that you can have. And obviously I'm not against all updates, so there will be some updates that will make it easier in like an indirect sense, but it's gonna be very tiny. Like for example, better weapons coming out which I'm not against, will increase the experience that you get in Slayer, for example. But this is very tiny compared to the gains that you would make with a Slayer buff, like something like Barrage Slayer has a much more significant impact on Slayer than something like a new Rapier, for example. So when we're talking about this account progression, I'm talking about for things that are linear. I'm not talking about things like PVM. I'm talking things like skilling, of course, experience. I'm talking about something like minigame tickets. It could be marks of grace, point systems, stuff like that, stuff that are linear. So obviously, I completely reject this view, and it goes both ways. I don't want the game to be harder, and I don't want it to be easier. But if you ask, what is better? Is it better that, for example, here, which one is worse? Is it worse that you make it 1.2 here, or is it worse that you make it 0.8? like, is it worse that the game gets faster here or slower here? And it's obviously much worse that the game gets faster than gets slower, because essentially you are rewarding here at this point. You're rewarding all the players that have already put in a ton of effort, um, as opposed to nerfing all the people that have already put in a ton of effort. So it's always better to make the game slower than faster, but I disagree with both of them. But if you were to choose between the two things, much better to make the game slower. Because if you make the game slower here, basically no one who hasn't already put in hours into the game will suffer from this. So that's why it's much better in this way. So we can ask a primary and secondary question here. So the primary question is, what should the XP rates for X thing be in a vacuum? And then two, should we then change it in a context? This is the second order question. So just because you have found out what the rate should be for something, because let's say you somehow could reset, you could reach an objective factum of what the rate should be for something, or how strong X weapon should be. Let's just say you could come to such a conclusion. I don't think you can, but let's just assume that. Then it doesn't follow that we should change it. Because if something has been out in the game for a long time, it actually speaks against changing it because of all of the aforementioned things that I've just said. So for example, now I'm talking about a PVM item, because it's very rare that you see nerfs to skilling content. So I'm gonna have to go with a PVM example instead. So if you have something like a blowpipe here, you might agree that the blowpipe should be in a particular way. It should have, let's say we can objectively say that it should have X strength, right? It should be this strong, and this is the correct answer. If we can somehow reach this question, then if it's been out for 5 years with this strength, and now people have benefited from X strength, if you then change it 5 years later, there will be people that have already benefited from it for 5 years, and then it would be wrong to change it, even if they are in a vacuum correct that the blowpipe is too strong as it is. So this is actually also an example of something where it would be wrong to change it, even if it has been out for 5 years. So basically you're committing two wrongs when you change something after 5 years. Like, it's wrong that you didn't get it right in the first place, but it's also wrong that you change it, because people have already benefited from it for 5 years. So that's why it's so important that you get it right the first time. And once you have established something, it's not so important what you establish something as, but it's important that once something is established, that you don't make changes to it. For instance, if you are to look at something like agility, let's say we have 75, we have 85, and 95k. Which of these numbers is the correct rate that we should have for agility? And here we're talking about at the beginning. We're not talking about what the rate should be now or something like that. We're talking about the established rate that we're going to make, and we're going to make them at the beginning of the game. Should the number be 75, 85, or 95? I don't think that you can come up with a correct answer here, because XP rates and much else in the game is completely arbitrary. So I don't think this number is more correct than this or more correct than this. I think it doesn't really matter what they are. But what matters a lot is when you establish, let's say, you establish this rate as the rate in 13, it is very, very important that you don't ever change it to 85 or 95, because this would go against the aforementioned principle. Once something is established, it's established, and you shouldn't change it. And this goes the other way too. If we establish that the rate in 13 should be 95k, then it would be extremely wrong in 2016 to change it to 75k. I also completely disagree with this, because once something is established as a rate, it should never be changed. This is extremely important. And it doesn't, and this is at the margins, of course. I'm talking at the margins here, where I say that this is completely arbitrary. Whether you choose 75 or 95, none of them are correct. They are both equally correct, but 75k, of course. Um, this is at the margins, of course, because if we are to talk about, let's say you got, if the question was, should we make the XP rate free an hour, or should we make it 10 million XP per hour? I think most people can agree that neither of these two options are good. But aside from that, there's a pretty large wiggle room. Like, even if you made all skills in the game 50k an hour, even the fast ones now that are like 500k, 1 million XP per hour now, even that would actually be fine. But I think it's good that we have slow and fast skills, and there's a lot of wiggle room for what is acceptable. The only thing that's important is, if we establish that cooking should be 500k or 1 million, I think both are fine. But it is important that when we have established the rate, that the rate remains till the end of time. This is the only fair position, and it's the only reasonable position. And again, this only applies to skilling updates. It doesn't apply to PVM updates. But it doesn't mean that we can't have skilling updates, of course, because if we look at potential updates here, this could be slider. So here we will have effort, and here we will have rewards. And by rewards, I just mean GPXP. Normally we would break this down into separate sliders as well, GP and XP into two separate sliders, because XP is obviously much more important than GP. So basically, when we have established maximum effort here for maximum reward, this is going to be our top rate for agility. It could be, let's say, 75k. We could still have updates here. We can have something that is lower effort, but also a tiny bit lower XP. We can have another method here, lower effort, lower XP. And you can then, on this tree, you can then apply like 10, 15, 20 updates. As long as you get them absolutely correct according to the slider. So we don't end up in like volcanic mine situations where you propose something as high effort and then it's just no effort for insane rewards. So just because there's a firm principle in place, it doesn't mean that we can't have updates. We very well can have updates. So this is a good framework to go from, and it should have been in place, and this is what the game should have been shaped off of. The next thing is that they talked about when they worded the buffs, they called it a rebalancing, but this is obviously not rebalancing, as Automology Riley points out here. This ain't rebalance, it is just buffing rates, and this is completely true. When we take a look at the rates, let me see if I can find it here. When we take a look at the rates here, you can see it is buffs across the entirety of the board. This is not rebalancing. This is buffs across the entirety of the board. And despite that, they haven't called it buffs across the entirety of the board. They've just called it rebalancing. And the reason they use an euphemism like this is because when the target market, when Redditors, when they hear of this, they will be hit by cognitive dissonance if you say something like would you vote in favor of these Easyscape changes, if you just label it Easyscape buffs rather than rebalancing, that they would be hit with cognitive dissonance, because of course they want the buffs, but at the same time they don't like to be confronted with the fact that they're just Easyscapers who want the game to be as easy as possible. So then these two things come into conflict with one another, and that's why they choose this wording of rebalancing when it's not rebalancing at all. It's just flat buffs across the entirety of the board, and it's absolutely disgusting to frame it like this. And it's just they only do it because of that, because I mean, it wouldn't make a big difference because all the Redditors, even if they called it Easy Escape updates, they would still vote in favor of it because nothing stops them from voting yes. Um, and anything that makes the game easier weighs harder than being called an Easy Escape Redditor, so it doesn't even matter for them. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say on this topic. It's absolutely disgusting, and I don't think you can defend something like this. You have to be very, very rational to think that it's good that someone in 2018 should have a better account than someone in 2014 for the same amount of time and for the same amount of effort they put in. It's completely disgusting to have something like this. And what we're gonna see, what we're gonna see in game, um, and what Jags are pushing very hard for, and we already seeing it now, is that they want all accounts in the game to just be NPCs. Basically, they want us all to have the same account, a ton of accounts that are exactly the same, no difference, and it's not very interesting the game when it's come to that point, because what they have to do then is they have to make artificial content to like, so there's some way to distinguish all these NPC accounts from one another, and that's why they are trying to add stuff like Colosseum and Blover. I don't want to mention Infernal Cape here, but that would be something else. Like these are ways that we can then uh, distinguish between the accounts that are all NPC accounts, because all accounts are basically maxed by default. That's the point they want to push us to. And so they will have to come up with new stuff, like something like a comp cape. And when we get a comp cape, they will make it easier so that they can push every one of these into the comp cape. And then we will all be NPCs again. Now, instead of all having a max cape, maybe back in the day we all had a skill cape. We had one skill cape maybe. Now we all have a max cape, and now they will all push us into a comp cape, and then we will just be stuck in a comp cape loop like we see on RS3, where the game just turns into a complete chore. Basically, um, we're gonna have our comp capes, and then they will release a new piece of content that we are then shoehorned into doing so that we can retain our comp cape. But I've been rambling for too long now. It shouldn't really be talking about something like comp cape here. But that's basically what the end point will be in all of this. So yeah, I've been rambling for far too long now, and I'll see you in the next one.